I am first.
Hello, I'm here with Caitlin to talk about why your photos can hear you. But first, Caitlin's got the new Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, we have a new Raspberry Pi coming out, and this is straight from the Raspberry Pi Foundation. This is not a rumor. This is not a drill, everyone. This is the real deal. So I'll throw this up on the screen. So the Raspberry Pi Foundation put out this, uh, I guess, press release by Eben Upton, which is the most British sounding name I've ever heard. Eben Upton. Okay. I mean, maybe Michael Worthington or something might be a little bit more British, but anyway, Upton. I love that. Anyway, so they are introducing the Raspberry Pi 5. And it is a lot like the Raspberry Pi 4. There are a few changes of note. So in particular, these connectors, they have removed the 3.5mm audio jack, thankfully. I don't think anyone's using that anymore. But they replaced it with a few things. So they have these two camera connectors over here. Over to the left, there is a PCI, essentially a PCI connector. So you can add NVMe drives to your Raspberry Pi moving forward with an adapter. They are also adding a, let's see, so they have the new chip, which looks different than the old chip. It has better cooling, and they added a new cooler to the device that you can get with it, if I can find it. There it is. So this is a new cooler. It's low profile, but it has a fan. So I guess the Raspberry Pi 5 is going to create more heat. It probably uses more power as well, which is not bad. If you want a low power machine, you can go find many alternatives. And let's see. Oh, they're adding a power over Ethernet hat, which is always nice to see. So if you want to power your Raspberry Pi 5 using power over Ethernet, that is an option now. Let's see, M.2 hats. We already went over that they're adding M.2 support. Oh yeah, so one of the new adapters down at the bottom of the Raspberry Pi will have the capability to connect a battery, so you can have a real-time clock right on the board, so it can keep track of its time and not lose it when you restart the computer. And let's see, they're updating Raspberry Pi OS, and that's basically it. So a nice upgrade from the Raspberry Pi 4. And supposedly the CPU will be about twice as fast, which, I mean, I don't know who cares about the CPU speed on a Raspberry Pi, but if you like fast single board computers, the Raspberry Pi 5 should be faster.
So have you built a project on a Raspberry Pi?
I built many projects on Raspberry Pi. In fact, I'm looking at one right now. So probably my favorite project with my Raspberry Pi 5, or Raspberry Pi 4, I should say, has to do with the fact that the GPIO pins allow for PPS signals. So you can configure this in the boot config of the Raspberry Pi. And PPS stands for pulse per second. So what I was able to do is connect my Raspberry Pi to a GPS receiver. And I have the pin from the PPS on the GPS receiver going to the pin of the PPS of the Raspberry Pi. What this allows me to do is to create a Stratum 1 NTP server, network time protocol server. So essentially, the Raspberry Pi, the clock inside the Raspberry Pi is synchronized with the GPS satellites, which have their own cesium clocks inside, which are then also synchronized to the cesium clocks run by NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. So essentially, and then I turned that basically into a wall clock. So I have this wall clock that is synced with cesium clocks to American standards, essentially. So on my network, I have a network time protocol, Raspberry Pi little device that is accurate within nanoseconds to what is standards, what the standard is in the United States for the time protocols. So
Well,
that's definitely been my favorite Raspberry Pi project. That was a lot of fun.
Well, while you're getting the time right, I've been getting it wrong. I set up a Splunk and Soar server, and I wanted the Splunk data I put in was more than 5 years old. So I thought that would give me trouble. So I tried to reset the clock to like 2018. And I put in a cron job that every time it rebooted, it would set the clock back to the same date in 2018. And then I discovered if you do that, it makes the CPU run at 100% all the time because it gets really confused. And I finally had to turn it off and let it have the right date and time on there. It took me like about 5 days to figure out why my machine was running so hot all the time.
Why was it so confused?
Because it was up for like 12 hours, updated a bunch of data, and then suddenly it was yesterday. And it's trying to like synchronize the data. And I think it gets really confused when it finds out, wait a minute, there's data here that comes from later. It's trying to like reorder it or something. I don't know exactly why, but I tried turning off all the add-ons. And then I realized, the way I've messed with the clock is probably hurting it here. And then I tried to make a cron job that instead of resetting it back to the same date, would set it back to like 3 years from today. And then I said, well, maybe it'd be okay to just let it have the right time. And when I did that, the CPU came down right away.
So if you want a Splunk network that's set either in the future or the past, you could probably just set up an NTP server that just gives the wrong time.
That's
and then
true.
all the devices would be synced up to the wrong time. So you could sync them all up to like 2018. And
Well, yeah, but the main thing I noticed is the 5-year limitation that I hit before doesn't seem to be there anymore. So I guess it's okay to have data that's 6 years old, which would be a better answer.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I've got a bunch of AI articles that caught my interest. ChatGPT can now access up-to-date information, but it's rolling out slowly and starting only with pay customers, and pretty soon all the customers. This has been a huge limitation of ChatGPT. It only knows about information up to 2021. So if you ask it anything about current events, it doesn't know it. Although somebody on Mastodon told me that he'd seen demonstrations that in fact ChatGPT has had access to up-to-date information all along, and they're just lying about it. There are examples of people asking queries and getting up-to-date information. I vaguely think I've done that too. Anyway, so I think maybe they've had, it's not been 100% isolated from the modern web like they said. Anyway, then there's another article on Gizmodo where a lot of people are talking about AI therapy now. Now that they put a voice on the AI, you can talk to it and they're giving it an emotional, personal, friendly, warm-sounding voice. So people are making emotional discussions with AI. And another thing, which I thought was a satire, is that they are the social networks. I think Meta is now making bots for you to talk to, so you won't be lonely. So you can have friends that are bots. And some people are talking about this may be a great thing for lonely old people. They can have a robot friend.
that's so sad.
Like madness to me.
That's so sad.
I mean, and this, is something I think I've really found out myself, like everybody else, about social networks. It's unhealthy because the people you make friends with on social networks aren't really friends. They're just sort of like drinking buddies. You have a fun on this network, but when you actually need help in the real world, they aren't there. And when you're not there to like make jokes, then you're not really making connections that are helpful to you in life. Anyway, they talk about people are shocked at how much they've strong emotional connection to these AI bots, and they say they're rediscovering the Elijah effect from like the 60s, where even a very simple chat program, people will make a huge emotional connection to it because they project all this human personality onto it, just like ancient people would worship a stone idol and imagine that it had a whole personality and powers and stuff. So I think, people really need social connection. My downstairs neighbor have a little puppy, and when they leave, it whines and is miserable because it doesn't have any humans around. I think people really need contact, and they'll project onto any object that gives them the slightest shred of response this feeling that they have a friend now. Anyway, the biggest one I thought was Mercedes-Benz. Mercedes-Benz, not Tesla, has rolled out full AI driving or full autonomous driving. I could not find out if they're using AI or not. But unlike Tesla, they will encourage you to take your hands off the wheel and watch a TV show and just let it do the driving. And they take all full legal liability for any accidents it might cause. And but this only works for certain roads where they have mapped out the GPS with accuracy of 1 centimeter. They have to go less than 40 miles an hour. They mostly want to be just following the car ahead of you in traffic, which I must say, when I was driving over the Bay Bridge commuting years ago, I kept thinking the worst driving in the world is driving in jammed traffic, where you have to constantly hit the brake and you're at very high risk of collision and you have to pay attention to something really unpleasant and boring. I said, man, I would really like a robot to do that driving. And they do it by having a lot more sensors than a Tesla. They've got several different sensors, just like the early ones did. And it just sounds like a great thing. And I'm sort of glad to see Tesla get their comeuppance. I mean, Elon Musk has been promising this for like 6 years and not delivering it. And Mercedes-Benz has rolled it out for free. And it have it on both the gas cars and the electric cars of the latest model. So the article here from The Verge doesn't talk about the technology in it very much. They talk about the user experience, but they say it works fine and it's easy to use. So that sounds pretty exciting to me.
So exciting.
Yeah. And then the last one I have, there's a list of all the open source large language models you can use. And a bunch of them are specialized for certain purposes. And I did a class demonstration a couple of days ago. There's one called Claude, which is specifically designed to write code. And I've got projects where I have students write Python code in Bard because Google says Bard can write good code. And the fact is it writes crappy code. It gets it wrong more often than it gets it right, even on the simplest problem. The one I started with was generate the first 20 prime numbers, and it can't do that. It will instead generate the first 10 prime numbers. You can't do that. It will just generate the ones up to 10. And when you keep trying to tell it over and over, it'll never figure out that you actually want a list containing 10 prime numbers, whereas Claude got it right like 3 different ways right away. So anyway, Claude 2 really does seem to write better code than Bard. And there's several other specialized AI models for certain purposes that sound very interesting. And you can run them all locally, which I think is essential. I think these web-based ones you can't trust them to keep your data private, so you can't really use them for any important purpose. Anyway, those are the AI articles I saw in the last few days that I thought were hot. And you got more dirt to throw at Elon.
I do, but before I do that, I'll talk about my background.
Oh yeah,
which I shot this last night, so this is fresh off the telescope. So I will hide my face. There we go. So what you're seeing is a star cluster. This star cluster,
it's like the Pleiades.
It is not the Pleiades.
Oh.
It is part of a double cluster of stars in Perseus. It's called the double cluster, but you're only seeing one part of the double cluster, so it's just one cluster.
Ones and bluish ones.
Right, and what you're seeing are the reason why I liked this cluster in particular is because you see all the different color of stars. You see the red stars, white stars, less white stars, dimmer stars, bigger stars, brighter stars, and it's this huge bash of stars all sort of coming together, which is pretty awesome to look at. So if we go over to the browser, so this over here is what we're looking at. So you can see it's part of the double cluster. So there's another cluster off to the side. But this is the one that we were looking at. You can see some of the red stars in Stellarium here that we saw in the picture. So
very nice.
Yep. And then let's see. So
how much time did it take to get that picture?
There's stars. So I got like a good image after like a 5-minute exposure. But I decided I wanted as good of a picture of this I could get with as low noise as I could get. So I think the total integration time is about 6 hours, over 6 hours of gathering photons.
And you don't have to stay up for that, right? You can go to sleep, let it go.
No. So the telescope is completely autonomous at this point. I set it up. I make sure that the first image goes fine. And then the next image goes fine. Once that happens, it's good to run on its own. So one of the things that is difficult about this type of photography is the fact that the camera is outside at night where it gets very cold, or at least in California, chilly. And what that means is that the temperature of the telescope is going down, which means that the materials in the that create the optical tube assembly are also shrinking because metal shrinks when it's cold. This affects the focal length of the telescope. So, or not the focal length, but the focus of the telescope.
Yeah.
Because you need the sensor at the exact position, to gather light. So what happens is that there's temperature probes on the telescope, and every time it goes down by like 1 degree Celsius, I tell it to run an autofocus program. Also, every 30 minutes, so it takes 30 minutes of exposures, and then the telescope will slew up to zenith where there's very little atmosphere and a good view of the sky, run an autofocus, go back to its target, run the autofocus again, just to be super sure, and then start taking more photos. So everything is fully automated throughout the night, and it can even keep focus.
There are alloys that don't shrink with temperature, and you could also put a heater on it to keep the temperature stable.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, and one of the things that is very frustrating about some telescope manufacturers is that they really haven't updated the optical tube since like the 1980s. You have things like the Celestron. So I'm using something called a Celestron Edge HD8, and it uses like imperial screws, an aluminum body, and these just ridiculous designs that haven't changed since they first put out these tubes. More modern scopes, of course, use metric screws and have sort of standardized attachments and stuff like that. But aluminum is still a popular choice to make stuff. But you could use carbon fiber. I don't know why not. That does not shrink nearly as much as aluminum, but they don't.
What I was expecting you to say is that mist will condense on it when it gets cold. That would seem to be another problem.
That is a problem, but easily taken care of. So when mist condense on it, you get condensation or dew. Really, it's dew. What we're talking about, and for that, the telescope has 2 dew heaters, so it just keeps the lens warm and the camera warm. So actually, the camera has a cooling system that keeps the sensor to below 0 degrees, like -10 Celsius all night. But there's also like around that, there's a heater, so like the rest of the camera doesn't get dew on it. And also the lens of the camera has a dew heater. Now the problem with the dew heaters, they work a charm. They keep the telescope from getting dew on it, and the telescope is a total dew magnet. Don't get me wrong. But running those heaters all night, the battery that I have to lug out weighs like 10 kilograms. I mean, it is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And then heating the entire telescope would be even worse. So, but it is, yeah, you're right. Dew is a big issue, but it's easily solved with heaters.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So anyway, enough telescopes. Let's talk about go on to the next article here, which is about Twitter. So this is on Ars Technica by John Brodkin. Thank you, John. You saved us on our podcast again. And so there's a report by the EU, and this is it right here. This is the Code of Practice on Disinformation, a comprehensive analysis of the prevalence and sources of disinformation across major social media platforms in Poland, Slovakia, and Spain. And this report goes on and on and on. We're not going to go over every single page here. It's a very long report. But the main finding is that Twitter, or X, spreads the most disinformation of all the rival social networks, which is not surprising. This is sort of why Elon Musk took over, right? He wanted to turn Twitter into his own personal, propaganda network, just to make people believe what he believes, which is not particularly great. And so the way this worked is they define certain keywords to look for. So they would look for things like, Russian something, or like COVID-19, Russian-Ukrainian war, that kind of stuff, and just look for information from there. And they found a good amount of engagement on misinformation. Misinformation grabs a lot of attention, both good and bad, people calling it out as well as people believing it. And yeah, and of course, Twitter removed a tool to report electoral misinformation. And in fact, there was another article about how Elon removed the electoral misinformation group over at Twitter because they were creating election misinformation or something. It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point is, there's a lot of misinformation on these networks. So just be aware. It's like Fox News, like MSNBC, and now like Twitter. All these networks are just full of misinformation. Just if you want news, go to Reuters, go to the New York Times. Don't go to Twitter. Don't go to cable news. Be responsible.
Well, I listen to a lot of MSNBC, and I must say it's not at all like the right-wing stuff. It is slanted, but it's slanted like 10%, as much as the stuff on the right. And it's clear that Elon Musk called out their election disinformation unit for spreading disinformation because he's totally red-pilled. And he wants, his idea of accurate information is to accuse everybody of being a pedophile every time they insult him, and say that Paul Pelosi was having a gay prostitute and that's why he got hit with a hammer, and just horrible stuff. So it's no surprise that Twitter's going to be the worst.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it is important to know that disinformation happens on both the left and the right, but the right tends to have even worse disinformation.
Oh yeah. Anyway, all right. Well, there was a Mastodon thing that came out talking about decompiler, about Godbolt, which is, they say, your gateway to learning reverse engineering. And what this does is it's a web page that will compile code with a variety of compilers, and you can see the assembly code and get practice putting in C code, or I think maybe other languages, and seeing the assembly it goes into. So it's good to learn assembly. But in response to that, somebody on Mastodon pointed out one that I think is much more interesting, which is Decompiler Explorer. So you put in code and it runs many different decompilers. So you can see it. I did not know there were this many free decompilers to take compiled code and turn it back into readable source code. This seemed extremely useful. It's got Binary Ninja, Ghidra, and Hexray's decompiler, which I thought you had to pay $10,000 to get. And somehow you can get some service for free of it here. So these both seem extremely useful for reverse engineers and people who want to understand the binary nature of code exploit. Anyway, so those are good finds for technical people. And so let's go back to you with the visitor from another world that's going to infect us all, right?
Yeah. So Bennu, the asteroid, sent back its goodies thanks to the OSIRIS-REx space program capsule spacecraft thing that happened. Anyway, so a few years ago, NASA sent OSIRIS-REx over to a asteroid called Bennu, where it gathered samples from the surface of Bennu and took them back to Earth. And then on Sunday morning, the capsule containing the material from Bennu landed back on Earth, and NASA has recently opened up that capsule, and yeah, it looks like it's been a successful mission. So I will share my browser if I can learn my computer here. Okay, so this is from space.com by Mike Wall, and yeah, so NASA opened the container containing the OSIRIS-REx asteroid sample, and you can see an image here. They're obviously the people doing this are highly protected, being very careful. This is a very slow process. You see them all in their bunny suits right now, in a sterile environment. They've only taken off the lid so far, and they found some dust that appears to be from Bennu, but they'll have more stuff in there moving forward. And apparently they're also, once everything is done, they will be displaying, NASA, I should say, will be displaying some of the return samples in museums. So in a few years, maybe, I don't know when they're planning on doing this, but you will be able to see these samples as well, which, as far as I know, is the first time a spacecraft has gone to an asteroid, mined it, and like brought samples back to Earth, which is brave new world, people. Brave new world. You're on mute, Sam. You're on mute. You're totally on mute.
There's a whole lot of science fiction movies that start this way.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
So the Andromeda, not the Andromeda virus, the Andromeda strain.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
started this way too. Yes.
The meteor comes down and there's something living in there.
Yep.
I,
It's
I,
very, yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen.
No, no.
Yeah.
So Bennu is native to our solar system. It's
Yeah.
just an asteroid, people.
Yeah. So even if you get to see this, it's just going to look like some dust and rocks, right?
Right. And keep in mind, I mean, Earth is basically just a giant collection of asteroids as well. I mean,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. All right. And the last one I thought was extremely interesting. I just saw it this morning from northeastern.edu. This guy says, my lab specializes in doing what people say is impossible. So he watched a TV show called Fringe. And I saw that show, but I don't remember. At some point, they decide somebody was talking in the room when this pane of glass cooled. And we're going to analyze the ripples in this pane of glass and reconstruct the speech. And a bunch of scientists said, this is garbage. And he said, maybe I could do that. And so he found out he can do that. You can take a photograph, a still photograph, and he can reconstruct the voice in the room when the still photograph was taken, because there's an adaptive process that tries to move the lens to compensate for focus and is affected by the sound of a voice. And modern photographs do not take the whole image all at once. They track gradually through it, scanning across. So you do get a time record of the vibrations in the room while it's scanning across. And you can reconstruct the sounds spoken in a room from a still photograph or a video when you're on mute. So
okay, so
yeah,
I'm calling BS on the still photograph. The video, sure.
Yeah.
Still, there's actually two things about the still video and the photograph. So first of all, the way it's supposed to work is that you have the vibrations affecting the little focus mechanisms in the camera, and
Yeah.
now you have a roll, and it deals with the rolling shutter of the sensor.
Yeah.
So there's two things wrong here. That, I mean, you would at the very least, the video, maybe this could work. It probably does. The problem is that the rolling shutter, takes the image, and then there's some processing time before the next image. So you're getting like a snippet of sound maybe out of it, and then nothing, and then another small snippet. But for still images, especially like in a room, a well-lit room, you're talking about an exposure time of, milliseconds. And so at the most, you can
Yeah.
get like a few milliseconds of sound, which is
Oh,
not
sure.
enough to like construct speech.
Well, sure. Well, what he says is he can tell if it's a male or a female voice. And I agree. They probably could not get a significant number of words from a still photograph because it's only a fraction of a second.
Right.
But if you had, that's right. It's a good point. Okay. Anyway, I think it's pretty awesome. It reminds me a lot of the Tempest project, and again suggests that when you think you're making things secret and private, not so much. And this will mean you shouldn't even, I don't know, it may mean you have to not even let people take still photographs of a highly secure area where secrets are being discussed, something like that.
This is why SCIFs exist.
Yes, that's right. Or you can't even bring in your phone or anything. They're not fooling around. They know that any kind of record of what goes on in there could be leaking information out.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, I thought it was very clever work, and we'll see what comes of it all. Anyway, I think that's it for this one. We'll have another one on Tuesday.